Mikelle was last seen around 6 p.m. near the intersection of Toltec and El Morro in Mesa. Investigators believe all it took was just 90 seconds for someone to grab her, put her in a car, never to be seen again.
Gonna find Mikelle Biggs.
You plan for the worst, you hope for the best.
It's been on TV. She's missing since yesterday.
It's been 25 years. A lot of time has passed, but what do you want the community to remember about your sister Mikelle?
I always tell people Mikelle was very sweet, charismatic, funny. You know, she was extremely smart. Everyone liked her. You know, she was on the student council. She wanted to be a Disney animator. Yeah, she drew very well. She was actually very talented. She was 11 and I was 9 at the time. Just that typical sister that's like kind of hard to live up to, you know, but at the same time I looked up to her. I thought she was very cool as much as we butt heads.
What do you remember from that day?
She went outside to ride my bike and, you know, she came back in and said, "I hear the ice cream truck," and asked for quarters. So my mom gave her quarters, and at some point I decided to join her. I actually don't remember her going outside or wanting me to go outside. I think I had asked my mom where she was, and she said, "Oh, she's outside. She has money for the ice cream truck." I was like, okay. And that's when I joined her, and you know, it was a typical winter break. Kids were outside playing. Parents, you know, of all different houses were kind of coming and going. That was very typical for our neighborhood. And we were out there for, I would say, a good hour or so. You know, it was late afternoon, early evening.
At what point do you remember maybe looking for her and her not being there?
We were outside and everyone kind of started to trickle in. You know, it was the typical, like, the street lights were coming on soon and it was dinner time and it got cold, and eventually I was done. It was just me and her out there, and she didn't want to come back in, and I was complaining that I was cold. And I was annoyed because she was supposed to come back in too. And I knew if she didn't come back in, my mom was gonna get mad and tell her, you know, go tell her she has to come inside. So I, you know, walked down our street to go back home, and I went in through the side gate and took the dog back to the backyard. And then I came in through the back door, and as soon as I walked in, my mom said, "Nope, go tell Mikelle she has to come in." But I was like, I knew it. And so I walked out through our garage and went out to the end of the driveway, and I yelled for her. I yelled a couple times. I looked both ways down the street and I didn't see her. And then that's when I turned and I saw something in the road at the end of our street. It was the T in the road where she had been riding, and I didn't know what it was. And I started to walk towards it, and I realized it was my bike, and the tire was still spinning on the bike. And I picked it up and I yelled. I looked for her a little bit. You know, nothing. It was, I mean, it was dead silent. And so I went home and I told my mom, it's like, Mikelle left my bike in the road and I don't know where she went. And my mom was kind of like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "Oh, she probably went to, you know, your friend's house. The Millers lived right there." So she sent me down there to go get her. And that was a very normal thing. We were at their house often. Mikelle would just pop by, kind of thing. So I went and knocked on their door expecting her to just walk out. And when they opened the door, they were all sitting at their dining table for dinner, and they looked surprised to see me. And I remember I was in shock. I was like, if Mikelle's not here, where is she? And then one of their sons came out and started to help me look for her, and I didn't know it at the time, but he found the quarters in the road and on the sidewalk. And that's when he said, "Go home and tell your mom we can't find Mikelle."
What do you remember during that time? Did you run back home? Were you scared? Or did you think you were gonna get in trouble? I don't know how you felt at 9.
I recall it literally like floating home, and I think I was trying to move quickly because I sensed the urgency in him telling me, "Go home and tell your mom," but I think I was also struggling to move fast enough. It almost feels like one of those dreams where you can't run. And that's how I remember it. And I know that I was scared and worried. You know, at that point, I didn't feel guilty yet, and I didn't really understand what had happened. I knew we couldn't find her, but I didn't know what that meant. The word kidnapped wasn't in my vocabulary at that point.
Do you remember telling your mom and how all that played out, or did you guys jump in the car and start driving?
I vaguely remember bits and pieces, so I came in and told her, and I remember her, she looked pale, she looked immediately worried. And she paged my dad, and then she called 911. And I remember it being like everything was instantaneous. It happened so fast, but I think things happened over the span of, between the time that she paged my dad and actually called 911. It was probably at least 5 minutes. But I remember it playing in my head like she was doing both at the same time. And I don't remember much from that point until a little later that night. It was like a blur, and I remember my mom being on the phone. I think she said, "My daughter is missing." And at some point, and I don't remember who it was, it might have been like law enforcement, it might have been my mom, someone used the word kidnapped. And that was the first time I heard it. And that was like, it was such a shock that even though I'd never really heard that word, I hadn't grasped that concept, I knew what it meant. Somewhere in my subconscious, I knew something was very wrong, that someone bad took her. And at some point that evening, I talked to my brother and my cousin, who they were like about 5, and I had to tell them because they were crying and it was chaos. And I told them, I said, well, a bad person took Mikelle, but the police are gonna find her. They're all here.
Do you remember speaking with law enforcement and having to answer these tough questions?
Yeah, actually, and it's kind of weird to think about because at the time, I was in shock and I was disassociated. So at the time, I just somehow in my little 9-year-old brain, I decided that my needs did not matter because all that mattered was finding Mikelle. So when they said, "Are you willing to talk to the media? Are you willing to talk to the police?" Yes, 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 because I wanted to help. And I remember talking to the police. I mean, I remember that night. It might have been like one of the first responders, I'm not sure, but like I remember sitting out on the curb talking to a policeman, and I remember explaining, exactly where she was, where I was, at what point all the kids left, the path I took to walk back, exactly how I walked into my house and back out. I mean, I went over it repeatedly. It was not as hard as you would think at the time, I think because I wanted to help, and so I was like happy that I was helping. It wasn't until years later that I processed things and learned what disassociation was, and learned of the long-term effects it had on me. And they determined she was alone for like 90 seconds, and it was a street filled with people who were just outside, and if she had screamed at all, no one could hear it.
Was that something that just never left your memory? I mean, it happened so long ago, but you remember a lot of it, and you were only 9.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those things where because it was, I was the last one to see her. I very specifically remember when I was crossing the street to go back to our house. I look both ways before crossing the street, and when I looked down towards the T in the road where she was, I could see her riding around, and I saw like her hair was blowing behind her, the sun was setting, and I just remember thinking like she was smiling, and her hair was all golden in the sun, and she was happy and having a good time, and that's the last image I have of her. It's kind of ingrained in my mind because it was so traumatic, and then also I have a lot of like memory loss and things that were repressed because of the trauma, and it's only been since I've been in therapy and processed things that I've been able to remember more stuff. And the more I talk about it, the more I write about it, interview about it, it helps me remember more.
Throughout the whole investigation process, how has it been working with Mesa PD?
I can't totally speak to that just because, it was my parents dealing with them.
Sure.
And, obviously with my dad being investigated, that, was very difficult. And, you understand that in most missing children's cases, it is a family or close family friend. And, he was more than willing to, he understood that, he was very forthcoming with information, and, he worked with them. And so it was really hard that, even after they knew that he couldn't have been, guilty because of his location and the time it would have taken. I mean, they knew that he didn't do it. He was still looked into, and I think, that obviously affects his perception of how things were. But my mom has a totally different perception. She knows what he went through, but she didn't go through that. She didn't have any issues. And anytime I've ever dealt with, any law enforcement, Mesa PD, the detectives, they've been wonderful.
How did the community react? I'm sure it was nothing that they were familiar with ever happening in the community.
The community, it was kind of amazing. They jumped into action. Immediately, everyone cared. They were out searching. Flyers were made up so fast and search parties were formed that when my dad got home, his first thought was, I need to go find my daughter, and he started looking too, and he had people approaching him, hey, this girl's missing, have you seen her? They were so invested in finding this missing little girl, they didn't even know that was the dad. They were looking for her, and they were gonna ask every single person they saw. So the community was really, it's really beautiful to think about.
How did all of this affect your life? I know there's different stages of how it affected, maybe the first couple years one way, then as you get older, maybe another type of way.
I would say, initially, it definitely changed. Just there was an immediate shift in, the tone in our home, I guess. Mikelle's room, it's one of those things where, are you supposed to go in there? Should you close the door? Holidays, do we put presents under the tree for her? It's just awkward and sad. And, each of my parents were trying to deal with it in their own way. And then us kids were trying to deal with it in our own way. And none of us knew how to, I would say, cope as a family. There's no right way to deal with that kind of trauma. And so I would definitely say the first couple years, they're very blurry. I don't really remember them. And then they were really hard and awkward. And then, as time went on, it got a little easier, I guess. It was just, eventually time, you just kind of have to accept the situation for what it is. And then on the 5-year anniversary, that's when we had a memorial for her, and we buried an empty casket. And I feel like that gave my parents more peace, especially my mom. I think she really needed that. And at the time, for me, I felt like this was a good thing to do. And I feel like that was kind of a beginning of a new phase. And I don't want to say moved on with our lives, but it kind of helped us feel like we were allowed to live without her. We were allowed to be successful or happy or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then I would say after that, the next phase for me really started, when I had my son. Becoming a mother is really what inspired me to initially start the page for Mikelle on Facebook. And, it started out as remembering Mikelle Biggs, and then it very quickly gained attention, and so it turned into Justice for Mikelle Biggs. But having my son was what made me want to have more of a connection, just becoming a mother. And I can't imagine what I would do if I had to go through what my parents went through. And it opened that door. And then the Justice page led to Advocacy and more media interviews.
Talk about the journey you are on now.
I got connected through a detective that got me involved in the Missing in Arizona events, and I worked with him, and I just did some media and interviews and stuff with that. And he reached out to me because he retired and is working with the National Criminal Justice Training Center, and he said, hey, they have this family perspective portion of this education course, and he said, I immediately thought of you. I felt like you would be perfect for it. Can I pass your name along? And I was like, I just got an immediate feeling. I was like, yes, this is what I'm supposed to do. I didn't even hesitate. I was like, please do. And then that's when I started, the process of getting the information and getting hired on as an associate. They have different courses that multiple agencies and like various people will sign up for and take. I spoke to someone who even, he was a FBI agent, and he said, yeah, the FBI has come a long way. Back in '99, like, we didn't do good enough. Like, he acknowledged that, and he said himself, there's always room for improvement. And it felt good to know that, like, I can present and give my story to people who want to improve. I'm not just sitting there making people feel bad or saying, like, you did this wrong. They're telling me, what can we do better? It's one of those things where you don't know a situation, outside looking in. It's really hard to say, to keep an open mind and, not to get tunnel vision or not to judge or anything like that. But that's really what you have to do. You have to be extremely open-minded. You have to see multiple, paths of, what potential of what could be happening. Anything could be happening, and it's very interesting that I go and I give a presentation about family perspective, but I'm also getting perspective as well from observing the presentation, and I think that's like the key thing.
Yeah, what do you hope law enforcement gains from this?
I hope that they are able to gain a lot of information, just the education in general of different possibilities. I did a lot of talking about just who I am, who Mikelle was, the long-term effects that it's had on me, how it's kind of shaped who I am today, how I am as a mother, those kinds of things. And then I talked a lot just about the facts of her case, and I do mention Dee Blaylock in the presentation, and then I just talk about, the experience that my family had with, the way my dad was investigated, and I even wanted to reiterate this to them in my presentation. I never, as a child, I never felt like a single person that I spoke to or had to interview with was at all like rude or uncaring. I mean, they were wonderful. But in that situation, you have to recognize when a child is disassociating, and to know to pull the child away from the chaos, to reassure that child that they are safe, that their parents are safe, that their siblings are safe, like, where everyone is, and not to worry about these things, and to also continue to say that. I feel like if I was told at any point, hey, your parents are inside, they're right here, and you're here, and this is why, and you're safe, I was in such a shock that I can't remember that. And it was like immediately after talking to the police, it was like a blur, and I didn't really remember it. So, just really knowing how to speak to a child in a traumatic situation and doing what's best for them.
What keeps you motivated to continue fighting for justice after all these years for your sister?
I guess for me it's because I want answers. I don't like the unknown, I want to know what happened. And for me personally, I want justice. I don't want just to know what happened. I would also like to, see whoever did it be charged, and for that to, go through. Yeah. And I feel like it doesn't make anything better. It wouldn't give me closure in that sense that I'm not gonna close anything on my sister, but she deserves to have a proper burial, and me and my family deserve to have a real gravesite that she is there, if we wanted to visit her. Right now it's an empty grave. I would like to just tell her that I'm okay. I could see her being worried about me, knowing how putting together the presentation and just talking to the detective and getting information. It was hard. It was really good for me, but it was really hard, and just everything I've been through with it. I would like her to know that I'm okay, and I'm doing this simply because I love her and that she deserves it. It's not coming from a place of like, I hope I'm making you proud or anything like that. I love her. She's my big sister, and she deserves to, have that peace.
What would you tell other families who are going through similar situations, who, with a lot of time passing, maybe have lost hope? What would you want to tell them?
I guess I would just like them to know that they don't have to lose hope to move on with their lives, or to have a life beyond their, missing loved one. Those things can coexist. You can make room for both. You can have hope and not let that consume you and overwhelm you.
You're making an impact.
Exactly.
Speaking with law enforcement, helping them understand families, and potentially giving them information that they can use when they're doing their investigations to learn from that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's taking something horrible and making something good of it. I can let this ruin my life and I can, be miserable about it, or I can take this horrible thing and try to make something beautiful.
And you have. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.